going on in Sudan right now, in a way, I'm a little embarrassed to talk about archaeology because, as you know, there is a war going on, and not really a civil war because it's just between various military fractions. Civilians are just suffering. And in fact, the news today was that Donald Trump announced that the US will try to bring peace to Sudan. But as part of the war, the tragic thing is that apart from people, antiquities are also suffering. Royal Ontario Museum, thanks goodness, not. The Sudan National Museum was looted completely. Some of the objects I will be showing you today will probably removed. I have no idea. Sudanese even don't know what was stolen, what was destroyed. So it's really a tragic situation going on. But I was working there during a nicer period. And the reason I refer to Calgarians on the Nile is that I am a graduate of University of Calgary, so even so born in Kalisz, Poland, I feel Calgarian in a way. So I'm talking about my excavations as a sort of Calgarian, but mainly because Professor Shinnie, my professor here, was directing excavations of the University of Calgary and the University of Khartoum from 1971 to 1976, and again 82-84. And many students and other scholars from Calgary worked there with him. So they were on the Nile. The title is stolen from the book by Roy McLaren. You may remember he was Minister of International Trade in Chrétien government. He wrote a book called Canadians on the Nile. But I asked his permission to use this title for an exhibition I did years ago. And so here we have the variant of Canadians, specifically Calgarians on the Nile. Now, I know it's mixed audience, archaeologists, professionals, and amateurs interested. So I like to start with bathing and locating. As you can see, Meroe just north of the confluence of the Blue and the White Nile, deep in the Sudan, in the country which has hundreds and thousands of fantastic archaeological monuments, including medieval churches, ancient pyramids, and at the site of Kerma, massive structures of perhaps the earliest sub-Saharan African great civilization of the Kerma culture up in the north, dating to about 2000 BC. So the country is really rich in fantastic antiquities, but was overlooked by tourists and archaeologists in the 19th century when Egyptology was booming. For two reasons. There were wars there in the 19th century, and area was plagued with malaria and other exotic diseases, so very difficult physically to work. Not to mention the very unfriendly climate, super hot summers with rainy season, etc. So it's a very difficult area to work, even in terms of physical conditions. And archaeological, climatically, or maybe in terms of ecology, the area that archaeologists study, which is this lower Nubia, upper Nubia, and central Sudan, is really quite different, because in the north you have those sandy desert, basically, and I started my work, strangely enough, not with Peter Shinnie, because I came to Calgary in '77 and he finished in '76. So when I had my first project in Sudan after graduating here, it was in northern Sudan in a place called Handukol and Lekti Basin, and it was very much like in this picture. So we spent lots of time digging out our car from various sand dunes and the likes. However, around Meroe, the landscape is completely different. You have sort of African savanna type, partly. It's fewer trees that could be because the trees were cut down to produce charcoal. But still, around the site of Meroe, which is a protected area, people are not allowed to cut the trees, and therefore you have the forest of acacia trees. And that's why it's not surprising that in ancient times, the area was full of big African game. I didn't take those pictures in Africa. I went to Toronto Zoo, so it's fake, but the animals are African.
The one I'm missing, which was very common, judging from finds of bones, was warthog. But it was, I was trying to get, I spent many hours and it was always hiding, so warthog is not here. Guinea fowls were also very popular for food because it was very easy to catch. So when you will look at the ruins of Meroe as they are now, think of the fact that they were in this very sort of African environment, that people had to protect themselves from lions, from leopards, from whatever game, at the same time hunting. And you can see that this depicted even in Meroitic art, like in this pottery. And I don't know, the statue of the lion eating a prisoner was in the garden of National Museum of Khartoum. I don't know if it's still there. The same, the pot, which actually we found, the one with elephant, was brought to Khartoum. And the last, fortunately, is from the collection of University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. So even in the art, they were depicting those big African games. And as for the people of Meroe, this is a reconstruction, but presumably modern Sudanese continue the same gene pool as ancient Meroites. But my former colleague and Professor Nick Millett from Toronto, he was excavating in the 60s and found in a tomb beautifully preserved, mummified body, but also with beautifully preserved outfit, the costume of a Meroitic warrior. So that's the artistic reconstruction of what a Meroitic warrior would look like 2,000 years ago, because that's the period we are talking about. Exotic place, far away, but was not totally unknown to Western scholars because of the accounts of various travelers, both ancient and modern. Already Herodotus, Greek traveler and geographer in the 5th century BC, mentioned, I don't know if you cannot see in the distance, I can read the text. Thereupon you arrive at a great city with the name of Meroe. The city is said to be the capital of all the other Ethiopians. Anything south of Egypt, the Greeks called Ethiopia, which is confusing now because the old country of Abyssinia took in the 1940s the name Ethiopia. But in ancient times, the term Ethiopia, and until beginning of 20th century, the term Ethiopia was used for regions south of Egypt. So this included Sudan. And the people there worship Zeus and Dionysus, that is Amun and Osiris. And then ancient world disappeared, ancient travelers disappeared. Arab travelers were passing, they left some account, but didn't know that it was Meroe, they just described the areas. But the texts of ancient writers were preserved in various medieval monasteries, they were copying. So all educated Europeans in the 18th century were familiar with those texts. And one of them was James Bruce, Lord of Kinnaird in Scotland, who was passing from what is now Ethiopia near Lake Tana on the way back to Egypt. He was searching, in fact, for sources of the Nile. And that's where he was passing. He mentioned we saw those heaps of broken pedestals, all plainly designed for the statues of dog, he wrote. I think it's a misprint for God. Some pieces. The important thing is that because he was familiar with ancient text, he said it is impossible to avoid risking a guess that this is the ancient city of Meroe. So that's the modern, so to speak, rediscovery of this ancient sites. And then in 1821, Turco-Egyptian army invaded what is now Sudan, and with them Ismail brought a group of European scholars, just like Napoleon did in the 18th century when he invaded Egypt. And those scholars were recording various sites, and they recorded Meroe. But everybody was interested only in pyramids, because they are really quite impressive. They are smaller than the Egyptians. There is higher number of pyramids than in Egypt, but they are smaller in size, but still very impressive and very romantic site when you visit it. So that's what they all described. And you can see here the pyramids of Meroe on the upper photo. There are two groups of royal pyramids. On the lower photo, it's Frédéric Caillot, the French traveler, who showed the appearance of the pyramids in 1821. He was there in April 21. Shockingly, if you look at the right side, we have this beautifully preserved pyramid of Queen Amenishaheto. It's, as I say, recorded in 1821. And below is a photo of what it looks like now. And it's in this terrible condition because it was destroyed by sort of Indiana Jones types of 1830s. Ferlini and Stefani from Italy, they got permission to search for gold and treasures, and they did it very methodically. So when you speak of methodology of archaeology, think about it, because they methodically dismantled pyramids from the top down looking for treasures, and to horror of horrors, they did find treasures. Those beautiful golden objects, there's many more of them, were found inside a small box inside the core of the pyramid rather than in a burial chamber underneath. When they brought those objects to Europe, nobody wanted to buy them because people didn't believe that somewhere deep there on, thousands of kilometers away from the Mediterranean Sea, such beautiful, delicate jewelry could be made. Eventually, the collection was split, and half of it was bought by King Ludwig of Bavaria for a Munich museum, and another part was bought in 1840s by a museum in Berlin. So now this collection is divided between those two museums. So these were the pyramids, which are marked on the satellite photo on the right, but 4 kilometers to the east, I don't know if you can see here. These are the remains of the town, and then the Nile as it runs now. Unfortunately, the town didn't attract attention of scholars. Even so, James Bruce made reference to those heaps of broken pedestals and ruins. Only 2 people in those early travelers actually marked the ruins of town, and one is this Frédéric Caillot, who left the drawings. And I was really interested in it because clearly it's at the front of the temple of god Amun, with 3 or 6 actually, 3 rows of statues of dog, as you would say, of Sphinx. You can see here. What is interesting that now only 4 are preserved, so I wonder what happened when the other 2 were removed. And then 20 years later, this German Lepsius came and he gave the first sort of plan of Meroe in 1844. And then, as I said, the revolt started in Sudan. The country was closed for exploration. The big battle of Omdurman brought the British power back to Sudan. And when the British, nominally it was ruled by as condominium with Egypt, so Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. And as a result, the first British expedition came, and it was led by John Garstang from University of Liverpool. You can see here him with his wife. Some objects in this photo are in the Royal Ontario Museum. And so he finally excavated the city of Meroe, not the pyramids. But these were the early days of archaeology, so you can see that the control of excavation was a bit loose. Massive work with hundreds of workmen digging, clearing, etc. Quite exotic. Now he's widely criticized for his techniques and methods, or lack of method. But I must say, thanks to this massive work on large scale, which was terminated in 1914 because of the outbreak of First World War, he was able to produce the plan of Meroe, and you can see those 4 main elements of the city. The royal city surrounded by this massive wall, next to it a temple of god Amun, and 2 mounds of what we now know are mostly domestic occupations, the North Mount and South Mount. And now we come to Calgary. That's the late Professor Shinnie. He died in 2007. He was, in fact, the last British commissioner for archaeology in the Sudan, in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, until independence in 1956. And then Peter went to work in Ghana and the University of Khartoum, and eventually in 1970, I think, he ended up in Calgary, where he was positioned. So he started new work at Meroe in '65 on behalf of University of Ghana. Then, when he moved to Khartoum, it was a project of University of Khartoum, and when he came to Canada, it became a joint project of University of Khartoum and the University of Calgary. Peter is sitting at the entrance to one small but important temple, pondering about the place. I know that he excavated it because Garstang, and this very place where Peter is pointing, found a beautiful bronze head of Emperor Augustus, which is now in the British Museum. And it's fascinating because historian Strabo mentioned that in the war between Rome and Meroe in 25 to 21 BC, the Meroites invaded the region of Aswan and removed many of the imperial statues. And it was so nice that later, it was confirmed by actual discovery. And it's one of the prime pieces in the Roman Gallery in the British Museum right now. Peter's interests were different. He wasn't after monumental building. His interests were basically in iron production. He came already from Ghana, where he was studying iron production in Africa. And Meroe has numerous heaps of iron slag. It was clearly a major center of iron production in antiquity. So this was one of his research areas. Another was simply establishing a proper chronology of the site. Because of the way Garstang excavated, it was a bit of a mess. And so he did more methodical research. As you can see, those long dark lines, these are Peter's excavations. Both, I don't know if I can, does arrow show on the screen now? So, small trenches in the north mount, and here, this long trench. And when digging this narrow trench, he came across this small temple and then discovered several others and realized that he found a whole avenue. So the main temple of God Amun was approached by this processional way, that's where processions would go, and on both sides were smaller temples or shrines devoted to various gods. So this became an unexpected discovery. I am not going to show you all those temples. Everything is published in 2 volumes, so final reports are available to everyone. But there he also found some nice objects, like this beautiful head of a god Sebiumeker, and I suspect it was probably stolen. I don't know what happened to it, but as I said, museum and Khartoum was completely looted. Some objects were stolen, others were destroyed, so I don't know its status right now. And now we come to my work, my first visit. As you see, I was young and thin still, with the guard of the pyramids, Mr. Karadim, aged at that time already quite old. Eventually his job was taken over by his son, Ahmed Karadim. So I was there first in '82. I was still in Calgary, but I was invited by Royal Ontario Museum to go with their expedition to Sudan. Expedition failed, but I had a chance to visit Meroe for the first time. And eventually, Shinnie retired, gave up his license, but I asked him, and he wrote a letter passing sort of moral rights. No, we have no legal rights. To me and to a Sudanese colleague from University of Khartoum, Professor Ali Osman, who also graduated from University of Calgary. So as students of Shinnie, we officially got the license to continue the excavation, except that instead of U of C, the official partner now of the Khartoum University was the Royal Ontario Museum, where I work. So you can see the 2 co-directors. Dr. Howeida is sitting on the right. Unfortunately, she now is in exile in Cairo, unable to return to Khartoum because her house was destroyed completely in ruins. Situation is still very dangerous because the opposition, the RSF, is sending drones over, so people prefer to stay in Egypt. Our goals were slightly different, because remember, my main job was in the museum. By the time I started working in about 1999-2000, tourists started coming to Egypt, to Sudan. The site became popular, so site preservation became one of the major issues, preparing it for tourism. And I can tell you already in advance that by 2011, it became officially registered by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. So this meant that we had to do other things than just archaeology. So we did surface improving on Peter's map, we did geophysical survey, and excavated several units. And that's made more or less what it looked like. Those symbols, M meant this was numbers given by Garstang. There are some KC, which is Khartoum, Calgary. So this is just spread of those various units which we're exploring. First, it was continuation of Shinnie's work on domestic archaeology. I am often sitting in the audience listening to lecture of archaeologists, and they constantly show those boring walls and walls. So I have very few slides of those, but I do. Unfortunately, we have them. But it's interesting because in the upper slide you can see how they were plastering this room several times. You can see several layers of plastering. One reason I continued the domestic archaeology following Shinnie was when Peter was digging those 10 by 10, but really 8 by 8 meter units. And because he wanted to have sort of nice squares, he never really exposed any complete housing unit. And that's what we were trying to do. We didn't succeed because indeed they were attaching so many other housings, so it's really tricky. And I can tell you from experience that domestic archaeology with those mud brick and red brick walls it's very demanding, much more difficult than exposing temples made of stone. And scholars, of course, say, no, we have to do domestic. But when I give lectures and conferences, I notice lots of people come to temples and magnificent and pyramids. Very few people come to listen about housing. And here is another area in this processional way, and that's where we found yet another temple to the series that Shinnie found. And next to it, in this round building, it's a bakery. We found lots of remains of ashes, and also very characteristic cones which were used in production of bread, because it's part of daily rituals. They were bringing to the statue of the god, they were bringing bread, so very often near Egyptian temples and Meroe you find those bread molds. In the background we're discovering another domestic areas. Geophysics, this was the first time done in Sudan, and so we did magnetometric survey as a sort of experiment. Because the problem is, I don't know if I have it, yes, on next slide. The problem is that the local sandstone contains a high proportion of iron, and it's the same material that is underneath. So we're worried that actually stone walls will not show up. Maybe brick walls will, but stone walls will not show up. But in fact, in this structure, which is the Palace 750, we did see, you can see very clearly the outline of the building. And that's because we sort of got the negative. We didn't really get the walls because they are the same as underlying bedrock, but the fill of the rooms. So the method did work, and now other people were using until the war stopped exploration, using magnetometric survey in Sudan. We did experimental in this area because Garstang already has seen the outline of this palace on the surface. We found some more details. But if you look now, before our survey, except for those walls in the front, you could not really see anything on the surface. So the technique really worked fine, and then we knew where we would find the walls, and it was quite nice. But the biggest surprise was that it was building made of reused blocks. As you can see quite clearly, they were massed from various different locations, and pretty fragile, bad conditions. Different scenes. On the top one, you probably can see the procession. Here I have more examples of blocks. On the one with the inscription devoted to Amun, god of Lord of all the gods. But in this example, you can see that there are many different types of stone used. It's all sandstone, but of different hardness. And incidentally, one other group from Calgary that used to work in Sudan ages ago was Talisman Oil, which doesn't exist anymore, as you know. And I once was hosting the whole group of 40 people from Calgary, the whole families from Talisman. But interesting observation was made by one of the geologists. He said, oh, you know, in those pyramids, the levels, the layers of the rocks are in proper geological order, except for one or two. And it was interesting because the one or two he pointed out were reconstructed in modern times. So Meroites actually consciously put in proper layers, while modern architects didn't pay attention and just grabbed nice block fitting and put it in a position. So it was a very useful visit by Talisman people, I must say. So those blocks we recorded, they were part of the walls. Those which were permanently stuck there we didn't touch. The others, like this one, which were fragile and falling apart, we took out. And this is my favorite. My late wife gave, it's a Meroitic queen, gave her name Lola. I don't know if it's very dignified, but so here's Lola, and this block was in Sudan National Museum. And again, I suspect it may be gone. If there is illicit trade, keep attention, keep your eyes open for Lola. So you find those beautiful artistic pieces. You can see she's a bit full body because the beauty model was there that the ladies had to be quite chubby. And that's how they are represented in Meroitic art. So that's the structure after our partial. We didn't have time to finish excavation there, but you can see there underneath are layers of earlier structures, and that's what brought my attention a lot, because it's a standard picture you could use in textbook, when you can see nice stratigraphy when an earlier wall is covered by a later structure. And this was important because the earlier wall is made of bricks only 23 centimeters long, mud bricks. And these are very characteristic for very early periods of about 800, 700 BC. So we're happy because we started finding early structures in this area. And that's what interested me most ultimately was, when was Meroe founded? We know that the Egyptians occupied part of Sudan until about 1000 or so BC, but in the area of Meroe, there's evidence of occupation until about 2000 BC, and then nothing for over 1,000 years. So I was looking for the origins, and you know, not only the walls suggested very early structures, but the material, the ceramics was very early, and C14 dates also showed very early structures. Peter Shinnie also had some early dates, but they were not associated with the structures. Now we have buildings which were from that period, and very early ceramics of the so-called Napatan period, from the period when these rulers ruled Sudan and Nubia, and some of them ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty from about 750 BC until 680 BC. So these are those great rulers of Meroe and ancient Sudan, as it was known at that time, Kush. Now next to the palace, I notice on the street going, you can see here, and it intrigued me because I was wondering, first of all, this palace is located on the sort of starboard sides when you exit from the temple. But I was wondering if we had a street, and you can see that it was sort of covered with mud bricks or mostly ceramics. And during the rainy season, it really gets wet and muddy, so I can see that they had sort of a bit of a town planning and used ceramics to plaster the road, the city. The temple itself was excavated, of God Amun, was excavated already by Garstang, but he did not necessarily the best job. He exposed the plan, but with many mistakes, and he dumped all the material immediately on the exterior walls that you can see on both sides. So we wanted to expose the side walls to get the plan proper, because it's the first building the tourists see, and it was important to prepare it for tourism and for scholarly reasons to get proper outline and dating of this building. But when you go there now, that's what it looked like. I mean, not now, but when we went there. If you compare the two, you know, that's a condition in 1912. and that's the condition in 2012 or so. Totally destroyed, and not by humans, partly by animals, because during absence of archaeologists, locals let their goats and sheep go there, and they destroy it with their hoofs. But that's because of the climate, which I already mentioned. It's really rough. This is not my photo. This is taken, well, you get link below. This is in Khartoum, the Habub. I didn't witness Habub like that. No, I did witness, but I was inside the hotel, thanks goodness. I should have taken the photo at that time. But what I did here, you have my own photographs showing the storm coming, not as dramatic as in the other one, and also rains and floods, which cover. The rains start usually in May and last until end of September, sometime into October. The river gets very high, floods often. So with this type of element, you know, it's not like in Upper Egypt or in Nubia too proper, when the things are really dry and even human remains are preserved so beautifully. In Central Sudan, you have to take into account the dramatic situation with climate leading to destruction of everything. And that's the view from above. It was before drones were used, we did it with a kite. So it's a kite photo. On the very bottom, you can see how we're able to clear the entrance on one side experimentally using bricks, so the temple looked a little better. And then we explored those inside the rooms, trying to get proper outline of the walls, of the interiors of the buildings, which were exposed by Garstein 100 years earlier, but not properly done. So we cleaned the whole area. In the process, we found things that Garstein missed, like this whole group of Meroitic inscriptions, which is fascinating because Meroitic is the second oldest written language in Africa after Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's been deciphered in the sense that we know phonetic values of sound, of signs, only 23 signs, so we can read the text, but we don't understand most of the words. Very few words have been deciphered in the sense of understanding the text of Meroitic, so it's fascinating. But it's a different subject for a different lecture. And then outlining the small rooms, like finding, you know, that the temple was not connected to neighboring, it was totally independent, getting proper walls fixed. So we got the outline, again taking the kite photography. Actually on this one you can see the scale because of the temple, because of our small Toyota pickup in front of the temple. So it tells you how large this building was. And that's, you know, the temple as it was known, the plan after Garstein, and then its present plan, which can be used now as a proper. So these are not very dramatic discoveries, but these are corrections that are needed. And that's a photo taken during one of the last, it was last visit really, because in 2020 COVID started. I already was in Sudan, but left after 1 week. This was University of Sudan National Museum started reconstructing the wall and protecting. So this site was never taken over by the rebels or by the army. So hopefully it's safe. And then I was interested in the origins. Fortunately, we found some charcoal samples, both in upper level of the occupation level and below foundations. One of the problem is that those dates show very late construction, you know, last century BC, early century, first century AD. So where was the earlier temples? Meroe was capital of the Kingdom of Kush of ancient Sudan already from at least 500, maybe earlier BC. So with Amun as a main god, where was the temple? And the Hungarian scholar Törek proposed that because of the finds in the area, small finds, this marked in red 293, this empty space north of Palace 294, that somewhere there was original Amun temple, which he proposed extend north-south, which was strange because no temples faces this orientation. They are always open either to the river or away from the river. So I suppose it must have been there, facing the entrance in the wall to this royal center full of royal palaces. But what intrigued me too was that, unfortunately he's not present here, Jack Robertson, one of Shinnie's assistants, I know he's in Calgary right now, but he's moving today. His place, he's moving to a new house. Couldn't come here. Anyway, he was there for 6 months, and during winter solstice, he noticed that the sun rays in the morning fall directly on the altar. Now, in this photo, it's a little off because I took this photo in early February, late January, early February. But it seemed to confirm that indeed in the winter you would have sun rays falling directly on the altar of the god. But what intrigued me more was that the sun rose above this mountain. The arrow points called Jebel al-Hajis. And this brought back to, now you can see here, I don't know if you can see, there is an arrow pointing to this Jebel. Right here. And I was wondering if it's not some sort of a sacred mountain, because on another side, another religious center in Sudan called Jebel Barkal, we know from Egyptian texts that both Egyptians and Nubians believed that the god lived there inside the temple. And even the crown of Nubian kings, this round one, was sort of reminiscent of the mount with this figure, Ureus, of cobra goddess in front of the crown. And you can see in the lower left side the drawing, which is of the depiction of this holy mountain, Jebel Barkal, as it was preserved in fact in Abu Simbel. So you can see the god is inside the mountain, in the cave. So here's the edge of the mountain, God is in the cave. And so I thought maybe we have a holy mountain, a sacred mountain also in Calgary. Not in Calgary, that would be good. But at Meroe. So that's what it is. I started already imagining that, you know, this mound rounded top looks very much like the crown, but it's missing the Ureus, the cobra goddess in front. But we still did go there to explore. I have this photo of, you know, sun rising above. And there what it is, you know, exploring the area. But we didn't find anything. And this is somewhat strange, I suppose, to finish this discovery part with anticlimax of not finding things. But when I was preparing the lecture, I remember that for a while I was working for one of the archaeological companies here, and for customers once we did a survey and we didn't find anything. But we had to give a report to the client. I suspect the oil company was happy that we didn't find anything, but I couldn't just write one sentence, you know, we didn't find anything, you can go ahead with your project. So I still managed to write 12 pages of not finding anything. So I tell you, my experience now is much more difficult than writing a scholarly article about your discoveries. Not having discovered anything and writing 12 pages, that's a feat. Anyway, so you would think Meroe, far away in Africa, it's not really related to anything modern, etc. And yet, we don't even know that some of the elements from this ancient culture from Nubia permeate our Western civilization. One motive, for example, which intrigued me, and I even wrote an article about that, is that in 17th century, in 1600, suddenly we have lots of paintings depicting one scene from the New Testament. When in the Acts of the Apostles, it's mentioned that Saint Philip, the apostle, met near Jerusalem a treasure of Queen of Ethiopia. Remember, Ethiopia was the name given at that time to what is now Sudan. And converted him to Christianity. And as you see, even Rembrandt painted this scene. This painting is in Utrecht, in Netherlands. And there are many, as I say, I wrote an article, I was able to trace quite a number of those paintings, including several in Quebec. Based on the original model of a 17th century painting brought to Quebec during French Revolution. And then this motif was copied by Joseph Légaré, the Quebec painter of 19th century, who made several copies for various churches. This particular painting of Légaré is in this National Art Gallery in Ottawa. So this I found quite interesting, how this motif referring to the ancient Meroe found its way to European and even Canadian paintings, and you can even find it in the gallery. Now the queen mentioned in the Act of Apostles is given name Candace or Kandake. But in fact Kandake is not a name but it's a title. And it basically means Queen Mother. And this became a popular name in French and English language. Maybe there is a Candace here present, etc. I just remember the actress Caroline Bergen, so that's why I used her in my slide. Another sort of ancient Sudanese motif in Western art is the opera Aida of Verdi. You know, it's a return of Radames from war in Ethiopia, which means Sudan, Meroe, they're fighting. Aida is name totally invented. I don't know how many of you know that the libretto for the opera was written by Gaston Mariette, who was an Egyptologist, very distinguished one. And so he used this Nubian motifs, and you know, the priest, her father, Amonasro in the opera, he's actually name of a real Nubian king, Amanislo, and he was the first king who was buried in the pyramids of Meroe. So there is this little underlying connection between ancient world and our times. And more to this comes in unexpected places, like this is the remains of a beautiful Egyptian temple in Soleb in Upper Nubia, up the cataracts, the Nile. And I don't know if you can see from distance, but you have all those graffiti saying Ottawa and places like this. I mentioned earlier that there was a rebellion led by Mahdi against the Turkish rule. The British, to help him, or actually the Turco-Egyptian government, sent General Charles Gordon to Khartoum to evacuate the population of the Westerners to Egypt. But Gordon sort of refused and decided to defend the city against the Mahdi army. Under big pressure from the media and hysteria in the English public, among the English public, Queen Victoria decided that let's send a rescue expedition. That expedition was led by Major General Wolseley. Wolseley was in 1869, 1870, he was leading the British forces against, in the Red River campaign, rebellion. He was using for transporting the army, the voyageurs, you know, those Métis and Indians and settlers to go from over the lakes to what is now Manitoba. And he was so impressed with those Canadian boatmen that he hired them to transport the British army up the Nile from the second cataract to the bend of the Nile. I don't know if you remember the first map, when the Nile goes like this, and then the army would cross the desert, the Bayuda Desert, to rescue. So he brought those few hundred Canadians. And by the way, my colleagues are making fun about Canadian voyageurs because the army came one day too late. That they were rowing too slowly. But anyway, many of them left graffiti in those places. And I suspect it's some of them on return to Canada named two places in Ontario. There is Khartoum and there is Dongola. I already visited Khartoum. Dongola doesn't exist physically, it's just a post office. But I have photo of myself standing in front of the sign Khartoum, Ontario. So that's yet another connection between those ancient and more modern events in Sudan. The last connection I can think of is last night when I took the bus 300 from the airport to the city center. I noticed, you know, ancient Sudan was known by the Egyptians and Meroites as Kush. And I noticed that on Center Street north of 16th Avenue there is a wheat store called Kush. I shouldn't advertise, I suppose, but there is another surprising Calgarian connection with ancient Sudan. And my bigger surprise after years of working was that I discovered that the old Mr. Karadim was still alive. As you can see, his son brought him, he was completely blind. I suspect it was a cataract. But I had this new photo of Karadim and myself taken in Meroe in 2004. And this technically would be end of the lecture, but fortunately I was talking fast enough to save myself a few minutes to hopefully show you a brief film to bring things to life. But also 2 slides before the film for archaeologists, because You know, I was showing buildings made of brick, mud brick, red brick, and stone, but most of those ancient Meroites and quite a lot of modern people live in those straw huts of this type, as you can see. And it was quite fascinating to observe sort of ethnological conditions. These are usually the poorest strata of the society. But some of them were working on our digs, so I was able to come and visit. And I was intrigued because I looked at this photo, especially the one on the left, which is clearer, and I was wondering, you know, I can see how everything is hanging. What would archaeologists find from this place if they came? Some post holes left by those things, the bed, maybe some pots left on the ground, and maybe fireplace. But most of the things were hanging to keep it away, you know, from rats and other things, snakes and scorpions and the like. Quite a little sort of ethnographic study. And now,
we are in Meroe, on the east bank of the Nile, 215 kilometers from the confluence of the Blue and the White Nile, located in the present-day Sudan, the capital of ancient Kingdom of Kush, which existed from around 10th century BC until maybe the 4th century AD. Since year 2000, we've been working jointly with our Sudanese colleagues from the University of Khartoum and Sudan National Museum. Excavation started in 1909 when John Garstang, archaeologist from the University of Liverpool, began his excavations. Some of the objects were donated to the Royal Ontario Museum, where they form the core of our Nubian collection. We employ local people for excavations, for digging. They come mainly from two groups. The Jailin tribe, people settled on the bank of the Nile, engaged in agriculture. Another group are the nomadic people such as the Kababish and other tribes who live out in the desert, but sometimes during our excavation season they come here. Among them, I am sure many have the genes, the blood of ancient Meroites, since they have been living here for generations. The first to mention it by name was Greek traveler and historian Herodotus, who in his book mentioned Meroe, the wonderful rich capital of the Kingdom of Ethiopia, as he called it. There were only two capitals of the Kingdom of Kush. The early one was established at the site of the temple of Jebel Barkal. That's its modern name. But its ancient name was Napata. It was established perhaps in 8th, 9th century BC as a Kushite town, but the temple was actually built by Egyptian pharaohs when they conquered Nubia. In 591 BC, there was another Egyptian invasion of Nubia, and those Egyptians destroyed the same temple. Perhaps because of that, and the fear of a future invasion, around 300 BC, the kings of Napata decided to move their capital city and the burial ground from Napata to Meroe. The northern group of pyramids is the group containing the largest number, maybe 53 pyramids altogether, although not all of them survive to present day. Some were completely ruined in antiquity, but many, unfortunately, were destroyed by the 19th century robber archaeologists. Travelers like Giuseppe Ferlini, an Italian from Bologna, who explored many of the pyramids searching for gold. And believe it or not, he actually found gold treasures in the pyramid of Queen Amani-Shaheto from the 1st century AD. When dismantling the pyramid, he found in the core of the pyramid, and not in the burial chamber, a vessel containing many beautiful jewels. The treasure was really astonishing, so much so that when Ferlini returned to Europe, he had difficulties selling it. People did not believe that such wonderful things could have been made deep inside African continent. In front of the pyramids, the kings or queens would erect chapels with scenes depicting the funeral and representations of a ruler on his way to the afterlife. They really relied on Egyptian model. Not only the scenes were those from the contemporary Egypt of Ptolemaic rulers, but the texts were also written in Egyptian. The shape of the pyramid is also interesting because they are once again different from the Egyptian pyramids. First of all, they are smaller, but they are also much steeper. And the point at the top did not end in a pyramidion, but rather there was a strange round structure, perhaps to reflect a sun disk, or the association between the dead ruler and the sky, and the travel in the company of the sun god Ra. Coinciding with the change of the seat of the kings, we also have the introduction of Meroitic language, we have the change in artistic style, in architecture, we even have the introduction of the new cult, the god Apedemak, the lion god of Meroe. In antiquity, the place must have been roaming with wild game. Lions, antelopes, giraffes, and elephants are frequently represented in Meroitic art. It cannot be a big surprise that the Meroites were worshipping a lion, the king of the animal world. Right behind me, you've got the pylon, that is the main official gate entry to the temple, decorated with a traditional scene of king smiting the heads of his enemies. Except that in contrast to Egypt, here we've got a king and a queen, showing that the role of queens in Meroitic society was much more elevated than the queens in Egypt. On the south wall, we can see 5 divine figures welcoming 3 royal personalities: the king, King Natakamani, followed by Queen Amanitore, and behind them the young prince. They are welcomed by god Apedemak. Here you have a chance to see a magnificent temple of a Meroitic god Apedemak as it was in its natural setting. The kingdom, which extended from the first cataract of the Nile near Aswan in Egypt all the way up the river to the Sudanese-Ethiopian border, had many accomplishments. We can admire today the remains of their cities, temples, pyramids, and palaces. The Meroites produced beautiful art, beautiful jewelry, objects of daily life, many of them now in museums, including the Royal Ontario Museum. Archaeology of ancient Sudan, also developing, is still at its early stages. There are whole cities to be discovered, temples to be excavated. We are right now in the very center of the city of Meroe. I'm standing in front of the great temple of the god Amun. Amun is very well known as the main state god of Egypt. It was also the state god of ancient Meroe. In front of the temple itself was an avenue of sacred rams. 4 are still in situ. In contrast to modern mosques or churches, ancient temples, whether in Egypt or in Nubia, were not places of worship. These were places where God lived. So only the privileged castes, the priests, the kings, had access to the inside of the temple. I am standing now in the sanctuary where the altar was placed. It's the 2 fecundity figures on both sides, tying together the 2 plants, symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's interesting, however, to think about the meaning of this particular scene in Nubian context. Possibly it was referring to unification of Nubia and Egypt as it happened around 750 BC, when the Nubian kings conquered Egypt and ruled as the 25th Egyptian dynasty for almost 100 years in Egypt. Archaeology is not always glamorous. You often deal with something like the space here, really nothing to be seen except for some broken red bricks, mud bricks, fragments of sandstone blocks. And yet this place provided one of the most astonishing finds ever made in Meroe, an object which is right now in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum, a beautiful large faience cylinder depicting lions and rams, sacred animals of gods Apedemak and Amun. The largest and best preserved was found right here on the wall of this mysterious structure. Another mystery is the purpose of the faience cylinders. It has been suggested that they formed bases for wooden pillars, for a perhaps light structure like a tent, something to protect the king from the scorching sun of the Sudan. We don't really know. That's something that has to be studied, investigated, and in fact, it has to be excavated. We know from history texts, from Roman writers, that between 25 and 21 BC, Meroites and Romans were fighting in northern Nubia near Aswan. We know that the Meroites invaded Aswan and took with them a number of statues. Just under the place where I am sitting, John Garstang found one of the most astonishing objects ever found in Meroe, a beautiful head made of bronze of Emperor Augustus. It was buried under the entrance to this building, which was clearly a shrine, and which served as a reminder to the Meroitic king of their great victory over the Romans, because every time the king or a priest stepped over these stones, they stepped over the head of their enemy. Archaeology is not only about wonderful temples, great pyramids, and richly endowed tombs. Archaeology is often about something very ordinary, and perhaps the single most important archaeological discovery made by the Royal Ontario Museum and University of Khartoum team here at Meroe is just this very ordinary wall made of mud bricks, sun-dried Nile mud bricks. It's important because it's the earliest existing structure ever found in Meroe, and this moves the history of the site back by at least 2 centuries. The date we're able to identify partly on the basis of ceramics, pottery like this, which is clearly very early. But associated with this pottery, we also found some burned bone, burned wood, charcoal. And this allowed us to use the carbon-14 dating to get more precise dates. And the dates point to about 900, 950, 850 BC. So this is really the earliest wall at Meroe. Not very impressive visually, but very important from a scholarly and historical point of view. My assistant Muawiyah and I are cleaning the decorated floor in one of the temples made of beautiful black and white stones. And this gives us an idea what the temple floors were like in ancient times. We have been excavating many different buildings, temples, palaces, ordinary houses. Unfortunately, most of Meroe temples are destroyed because Meroe lies within the rain zone. In the summer we get seasonal rains, and therefore whatever we excavate, we very often have to cover with sand to protect it for future generations or until we erect special protective structures.
In 1995, when we came here, we came through this gate here for the temple about 1.5 meters higher, because the whole front part of the temple, including also the very back, was up to here with sand and rubble. And what actually had happened is that the whole column from here had just collapsed like this. We were able to clear down to the floor and then start putting the drums back up again. That's what's been done here. As you can see, that's why these are lighter color, because they were buried early. You have to imagine that the whole temple was plastered in white and probably decorated with a little bit of yellow color at the very bottom. And when the plaster started to crack, then the water started to go inside and the brick started to disintegrate. We have only one phase of excavating, and all of it from the Meroitic period, about 50 before Christ to 50 after Christ, built by King Natakamani and by the Queen Amanitore.
More than 90% of the pottery that we find comes in the form of sherds, just broken pieces. And yet pottery, because it's such a solid material, survives through thousands of years, and it's an important tool of archaeological research. I would like to pick up a few more pieces, but I have to be very careful. Scorpions like to hide in those quiet, calm places. Voila, here you've got another nice piece. The pottery in this heap is all from between the 7th and 10th century BC. Although the majority, 90% of pottery was ordinary, about 10% was beautifully painted pottery used perhaps for display or as containers for wine. Meroites seem to have been fond of wine, and that's why a vine leaf motif is very common on some of the pots. The greatest success of the joint University of Khartoum Royal Ontario Museum expedition at Meroe is discovery of this earliest deposit of pottery and the earliest buildings ever found at the site of Meroe. I am right now in the so-called Royal Bath. It contains a deep basin surrounded by decorated painted walls with freestanding sculptures in front of this. Here you'll find all the spouts from the pipes which were bringing the water from the Nile into the basin. It is possible that it had something to do with religious beliefs, with perhaps the cult of water, an important element in a hot country like Sudan. All around the basin you had decoration in the form of lion faces and bull faces. And one such statue of a bull face is in the collections of the Royal Ontario Museum and has its twin companion still in situ right behind me. These bull figures were made of Nubian sandstone, with the rear end of the figure left unsculpted, as it was embedded in the wall surrounding the pool, while the front was fully sculpted with ears and a spout. And the face was decorated in red, while other parts were done in blue and yellow. It must have been a very colorful and beautiful place, the Royal Bath in Meroe in ancient times.
Cities to be discovered. When I was working in northern Nubia, mostly Christian, lots of Meroitic sites. I remember I even made it to the front page of Globe and Mail when I told that there are whole cities to be discovered, because we found like 7 or 8 huge mounds, totally untouched, unexcavated along the banks of the Nile, just waiting to be cleared. They're mostly medieval, but going back to ancient times. So indeed, it's archaeologically it was a paradise, but unfortunately it's in a tragic situation. And that's it tonight. I can stand here and answer questions if there are any. Thank you very much.